Last class we looked a little bit at this Galloway article, which I have some of over here on the right with the yellow highlights. And then for this class we're looking at this article by Ryan, which is on narrative. And so I want to talk about the models they set up for how we understand structuring information and stories. What Galloway says is that, Galloway does this distinction between two types of video games, the first-person shooter and the kind of massive online player game. He says targeting in Counter-Strike, talks about targeting. So targeting in Counter-Strike is essentially optical, whereas targeting in the World of Warcraft is essentially spatial. So then he goes on to this like super duper technical mode of describing things. But essentially what he's saying, if you look at the two, a couple examples. This is from Red Dead Redemption. It is, this guy is shooting a guy. That's that's targeting. It's optical. We do get a sort of an overhead view over here on the left, but essentially the experience of playing this game is that you are reenacting aiming a gun and shooting it. So identifying a location, picking a location on the screen, and clicking on it, and something happens as a result, as opposed to here's quite a kind of an old online game called Caesar. But you recognize like Zoo Tycoon or any of these kind of games where you construct things and you're moving spatially. So you're creating a spatial landscape, but there's also a lot of stuff on the screen that your mouse is actually moving around to. You have to click, 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 click all over the place. Here's some more recent examples, but even in these, you see how much is on the screen, how many places you're going. So just literally in terms of, that's a bad thing too, see? Have to be careful. Literally in terms of where you're moving on the screen, that's the basic distinction that Galloway is making. And Galloway goes on to say that as with Counter-Strike, he talks about relationshipping. So he talks about targeting, he talks about relationshipping. He says relationshipping is weaponized in Counter-Strike in an optical way. But in World of Warcraft, it is no longer strictly the optical challenge of matching up the two ends of a vector ray in the proper fashion, given a rifle sight here and a visible landscape out there. So that's what you do in a first-person shooter. You match up the two ends of this imaginary vector ray. Instead, relationshipping in the World of Warcraft is reconstituted as a weapon of machine-calculated intervals and proximities, moving and changing fluidly through a system of alternatives. The hyperlink is the weapon, not the sightline. So the hyperlink versus the sightline. We talked a little bit about how in Dracula sort of tries to recreate a novel as a hyperlinked mode of information, an informatic system, something that targets spatially. So moving over here to the Ryan article, she's interested in the idea of how to tell a story, narratives. Do computers help us tell stories? Do they change how we tell stories? What are online narratives like? And she talks about these different models for how a digital narrative might work. This is Steve Jobs saying, "Our interfaces are stories we tell ourselves to ward off senselessness. The importance of stories, of marrying technology and storytelling skills, and the package of a computer game named StarCraft advertises its capacity to let users tell their own stories." So here he's talking about StarCraft. He says, "What this phrase really means is that the user can create new mazes and new levels of difficulty, adding weapons and characters to the game by selecting items from a fixed repertory." So, whereas Galloway identifies StarCraft as being spatially organized, Ryan is talking about, basically critiquing the way it's described as being a storytelling format, and he's essentially saying it's not really storytelling. It's really creating a maze. And then she goes on to talk about some really, establishes some really interesting distinctions about different ways that one might move through a digital landscape. Let me therefore consider the other option. Hypertext challenges the notion that there is only one sequence and one plot in the text, and readers are done when they have reconstructed an event trajectory that leads from the beginning to the end. It is up to the reader to rationalize every reading and consequently every arrangement of lexias into a coherent story. In a hypertext environment, a lack of linearity does not destroy narrative. Ryan then goes on by the end of the article to sort of establish these basic structuring principles. Where did they go? Well, oh, there we go. The claims made in this essay can be summarized by three seemingly incompatible statements. The truly distinctive feature of digital media is interactivity. This feature enables the user to choose his or his way through the text at runtime. Interactivity does not make it easy to tell stories, because a narrative interpretation is a response to a linear structure that is built into the text, not a type of meaning freely created by the reader out of any set of data. And three, yet without some degree of narrativity, digital media cannot become a major presence on the arts and entertainment scene. Okay, so let's try to figure out what they're talking about. So here we are with Red Dead. I think one useful, and Red Dead, you could say, is more narrative than a game like Caesar or Zoo Tycoon. It is more narrative, that is, it is set in time. When you're in Red Dead, when you're in a first-person shooter, you're moving in time, and you get interrupted by the space, or you get kind of distracted by the space. Whereas, in a game like this, you're operating in space, you're operating spatially, and sometimes there are temporal things that interrupt you. So for example, you have to feed the animals in Zoo Tycoon, or somebody's invading, or something like that. Time limits what you can do, but you're doing things in space. Here, you may be moving through space, but what matters is a story. It's a story driving forward. You're killing a certain number of people, you have to reach a goal, and you're moving in a more linear fashion. So this is more linear, it's more like a narrative, it's targeted. So narrative, story, targeting, optical targeting go together, and spatial and hypertext and non-temporal go together. So let's look at some websites and see if we can kind of understand this. So, oh, and the other thing I wanted to build on was this notion of relationshipping. Like, what are the emotional implications of relationshipping? One of the things we talked about in Dracula was the way, by rendering things into information, you drain emotion from them. So where does emotion live in this narrative versus spatial, temporal versus spatial mode? So let's think about how you design a website. Usually people talk about website design, they talk about text versus pictures. I want to think about space versus time. So let's just look at a newspaper website and think about, is this a spatial or a temporal structure? Well, when I'm looking around here, I'm moving the mouse all over the place. There's a whole lot of stuff all over the screen. That suggests it is more like this kind of structure. It's less like a story. That's a surprise for two reasons. First of all, it's a newspaper. Therefore, it's about news. Therefore, it's very much time dependent, and therefore it's very much set in time. But that's consistent in the sense that we're saying when you're working spatially, you're limited by time. You can only read today's newspaper today. If you read it tomorrow, it's run out, in effect. If you have a physical, one of the reasons that news websites are set up like this is that they're set up by people who are used to paper newspapers. And of course, when you have a paper newspaper, you literally open the front page, and you have sections, and you're moving those around on the table, and you're using your body to open them and move through them. One of the fun things in the New York Times is that they actually let you like click on today's front page for those people who can't. I can't find it now, but usually there's a little button and you click on it so it looks like a piece of paper for those of you who are more freaked out. You have more freedom in this environment than you would in a physical paper, but it's still essentially a way of moving spatially. And you can see how different, obviously you have the tabs along the top, but it's much more likely that you are going to move around. Your eye is caught by a picture and you move over to an interesting word. Over here on the right, they wait a minute, and see it's it's taking me places. It's taking me into a maze. I am easily lost in the maze by accidentally clicking on things. Over here is the opinion. You know, this is international news. Down here we have something, it's like a long-form news. Here's something about the 2020 race. The way that hypertext work is that you click on something and you move laterally. That is, ignoring time, you move spatially side to side. You click on this thing, it leads you to this thing. Now, let's compare that kind of spatial motion to Facebook, for example. So this is my sister-in-law, Beth Tanner. She's a kindergarten preschool principal. Facebook, of course, is structured as a timeline. So it is very much advertising that what we have here is a story, the story of one's life. And as you go through your timeline, you move backward as you go down the page, and here is, so that already is somewhat strange because we're used to stories that move forward. If you go out on a date and you tell somebody the story of your life, you start at the beginning and move forward. You typically don't move backward. But okay, you can see how my sister-in-law's timeline is marked by various people's birthdays. There's her nephew's, well, my nephew's birthday. There's her dog's puppy training graduation. That's her new puppy, Cece. Everyone's pleased about that. This is very cute. Somebody posted this. You know, you teach in New England when. You can, so on the right hand you have temporal. On the left hand you can go over to photos. I wonder if I'm in any of these. I'm sure I am. Am I in that one? Oh yeah, there I am, right there. It encourages you to kind of move back and forth between a temporal and a spatial mode of understanding this person's life, but dominantly this is a story. So for example, as you move back in time, you see various people's birthdays. There's her brother's birthday. Here's some people she went to a restaurant with. Looks like it's the holidays. Here's the tree. That's Cece with the tree. When we get a little farther back, this is the day her former dog died. This was Annabelle. She's a wonderful little Bichon. She was 15 years old. And as you can see, Beth went out and got another Bichon, but that's Annabelle when she was younger. It's very sad. That was in November. And school. There's Annabelle in the fall when she was old and sick dog. You get the idea. You can reconstruct a life. There's a process of reconstruction of temporal organization going on here, which is because we want our lives to be organized temporally. Okay, fine. Makes sense. Now, in a retail environment, how do we think about targeting? How do we think about relationshiping? So here's my Amazon Prime page. Is this spatial or is this temporal? Well, it's the first thing I see is continue watching. That is, this was the last thing you watched. I was watching Informer on Prime Original. It's pretty good. Also, The Great British Baking Show. As you can see, I'm an old person. Here's the last thing I bought. I bought some Starbucks coffee. If I go up here, I can see my browsing history. Ooh, there's underwear. Let's get off of that page. Or I can go to buy again, and it shows you all the stuff I bought, like dog eye cleaner and chocolate and packaging tape. As you can see, I'm an old person. There's the underwear again. This is bad. Okay. All right. So it creates for me an environment in which my retail story, the story of my buying life, is dominating what's happening. Can I move around in it spatially? Certainly. That's one of the ways in which all shopping works. But one of the things you'll notice about Amazon, you see this here, this account and list. This is Amazon is well known for having like really bad navigating structures. So for example, it's really, really hard to find like, Prime Video. You'd think that would be real easy to find. You have to work really hard to find it. So that it's attempting to create a story of purchasing and watching for you to step back into. So it creates its own kind of storyline that's a bit more like Facebook. Let's look at Uniqlo, different sort of website. I mean, you'd think it would be the same as Amazon, but it's different. And in fact, you can tell that right away because of all the words here and because of all the focus on encouraging you to quickly identify what it is that you want, identify sales, or identify, say I want to buy a dress shirt. There's dress shirts. And I can organize it quickly with these drop downs, right? So I need a large. I'm going to buy pink. And I want it to be whatever, regular fit. Now, the point is to move you quickly through this environment. It's structured spatially, but it's limited by time. So you want to move quickly, but the structuring is spatial. This is structured temporally. It's structured as a story. It's limited by space. It's harder to move around on the Amazon website than the Uniqlo website. So why is that? It's a different retail model. One is encouraging you to quickly master the site itself and get something accomplished within a temporal structure. So it's more similar to this kind of game. You want to click over here, you want to click over here before you run out of time. In this case, it wants you to step into this world and move through it, move through your story. So in the same way that this creates a story, you're creating a story that you move through. That's what the Amazon website wants to do. Okay, so why is all of that interesting? Well, in part it's interesting, I think, for our purposes. In the long run, one of the things I'm going to want you guys to do is to set up some kind of website that gives the experience of literary artwork, not unlike the way you would organize the experience of a retail structured website, to sort of understand how information gets placed in its relationship to the reader. One of Ryan's big points is that, if we go back to Ryan, is that interactivity, so that is the ability to interact easily, does not make it easy to tell stories, because a narrative interpretation is a response to a linear structure that is built into the text, not a type of meaning created by the reader out of any set of data. I can go to Uniqlo and very quickly decide what I want so that I can buy it. When I go to Amazon, it's much harder to do that because I'm stepping into a story. It is more narrative. Now, Amazon is the most successful retail website of all time. What that suggests is that there's something really important about introducing narrative back into what is in most circumstances essentially a spatial structure. And so that's sort of how we want to move towards thinking about not only literature but how we organize information digitally in general.